This is more of a video essay, and I apologize that I don't have quite as many visuals as I usually do in my videos. I just had some thoughts on the original 1937 Snow White that I wanted to get out quickly while this is sort of a topic that is still being discussed right now. My channel is focused on art, and film is a kind of art, so I hope that this is not wandering too far afield. And of course, it's animation, which is even more applicable since I usually talk about painting. Snow White's being talked about a lot right now because Disney just released the live-action version. And Rachel Zegler, the actress from the new live-action version that was just released, famously said that this original version was not just outdated, but so outdated that basically no one of her generation can relate to it or really get anything out of it. I mean, she didn't say that literally, but that was sort of the implication of what she was saying. So I want to talk about what I get out of it and what I see in it. There are 3 scenes in particular, and really just 2 scenes that I'm going to kind of focus on the most, because there's something in those scenes that I want to understand. I want to unpack it a little bit. But I do want to sort of say right out from the outset that I'm not trying to pretend that this movie is such a cinematic masterpiece that it should be in the highest echelons. I do think there are, quite a few boring parts. But honestly, I don't care. I know some people can't stand being bored, but I really don't think that's the biggest sin in a production. I can tolerate a few boring parts if there are some parts that are so compelling and interesting and mysterious that they keep me guessing and wondering and coming back to it just for those parts. And if a movie doesn't have those really deep things, then that's what, for me, just I can't stand just pure entertainment without any sort of deeper sense of nutrition for the human soul. So I might be weird that way. I'm not saying that my approach towards this is going to be the standard or the most common or the most usual. But if you are like me, if you happen to be like me, you might appreciate hearing these thoughts. So the scene I want to start off with is the wishing well scene. And this is my favorite scene in the whole movie. I just absolutely love this scene. And there are people who would say, well, actually, I think that's the most boring scene in the movie, maybe. I don't know. It's very slow. The music is very slow. But there's something in it that just keeps me coming back and wanting to, I don't know, to bathe my soul in it. So it starts with Snow White coming to the well to get some water, I suppose. And she's talking to the pigeons there. And she tells them that this is actually a wishing well. And we don't really have a sense of whether or not she's just making this up as a game, kind of as a childish game that she's playing. She's just enjoying pretending that this is a wishing well, or whether it really is. We kind of have more of the sense that she's just pretending. And so when she's singing into the well, we hear her voice echoing down, and then it shifts. The camera perspective shifts to this beautiful. It was such a wonderful idea for them to be looking up through the bottom of the well towards Snow White, and then seeing these beautiful little ripples on the surface as her voice echoes down the well. I just love that part. And she wishes, famously, that the one she loves will find her today. Now, Walt Disney wastes no time in bringing Prince Charming immediately right over the wall to her. Of course, he happened to be riding by at that time, heard her song, and out of curiosity from the beauty of her voice, has sort of hopped over the wall and makes himself known to her. She gets scared and runs off, but then comes back to the balcony window to peek out and look at him as he sings now that I've found you, hear what I have to say. And so the song transitions to a new melody, a different melody. It's really a different song, but it feels like it's the same song. It kind of flows from the song that she was singing into this song that he's singing in a very beautiful way. And yet, yeah, they really are distinct songs, and yet they go together so nicely. And he's basically saying, he's basically just, proclaiming his love for her. Of course, this is love at first sight, which is very common in fairy tales. We all know that it's maybe not such a realistic thing to expect in real life, but it can happen in fairy tales. It's just understood that this is a thing that happens in fairy tales. And for me, there's nothing out of place about that at all. This is a magical story. It's not supposed to be realistic. And so when this prince stands there and proclaims his love, we have to sort of just take it on faith that let's say good faith. Take it on good faith. Like, he means it. And in this universe, he knows that she's the one. And this doesn't need to be the way that people should really make their life decisions or come together. It's a symbolic story. A fairy tale is always a symbolic story. And the prince symbolizes true love. Snow White is embarrassed about the rags that she's dressed in, but she sends down a bird to take a pigeon, a dove, I suppose, to take her kiss to him. So those are the events of this scene. It's very simple. It's direct. It's right to the point. There's nothing like mysterious in those events in and of themselves. And yet there's something so compelling about this scene for me. And it's definitely related to the fact that the art is beautiful in this scene. It was beautifully painted. There's these beautiful watercolor backgrounds combining with a level of animation that you just don't see these days, outside of digital stuff. Like, animators don't generally spend the amount of time needed on physical artworks to create this level of detail and beauty. And there's just something really wonderful about the sort of rustic feeling of the vines creeping up around this well. And like I said before, the way they animated these sort of drops of water as we're looking up from like a fish's perspective, basically up through the well at Snow White as she sings, as her voice echoes down the well. There's just something so incredibly beautiful about that. Now, I suppose there is something symbolic about a well, there may be something like archetypal. If you want to go down the route of like Carl Jung, and is it Jung or Jung? I think it's Carl Jung. This sort of analysis of symbols and the sort of archetypes that they have in the human psyche. The well is deep, right? The well is deep. There's a depth there, and I don't know. I'm not personally that interested in going too deep down that well, because while I love symbolism in fairy tales, I don't think it's necessary to arrive at a fixed symbol. That is to say that a well can be deep and symbolic and pregnant with meaning without you don't really need to arrive at a decision about like what this could mean. It's more of a playful thing in my opinion. It offers you a range of possibilities if you do want to dig into it. And I don't think you should settle on one of those possibilities. It's just something it just adds a depth. And of course, there is symbolism in the coming together of two souls in love. The dynamics of romantic attraction have in and of themselves some sort of a deeper symbolic meaning. And, just what that is, you can speculate endlessly on it, but that is the way to look at this. The way to look at this is not to look at it from the perspective of, these are just like two literal people who are just literally meeting and literally falling in love. And, this is a pattern that we should literally emulate. No, it's a symbolic kind of the beginning of this temptation into a union that is sort of divine or miraculous. That's the way to see it. There's the mystical tradition of Kabbalah, which talks a lot about like the union of the male and female principles as some sort of like divine or holy plan. And I think that is kind of the way to look at the symbolism of the prince and princess in a fairy tale. And some people go, really deep and psychological with this and could say that there are different aspects of the psyche within one human, like within one person. This is like a process that's, supposed to be, going on inside your soul. So it's not even a literal external person that you're supposed to be looking for, but like an inner process. And so you could go really deep with this if you want. Again, I don't think you need to. It's just that the fact that these things are hanging around in the background, that they're there, that these seeds are sleeping under the soil and they might sprout, in a variety of different ways, is what makes the story feel rich. So if you're a materialist and you really for you, all that matters is like a very literal interpretation of everything, you're not going to really get much out of a symbolic story like a fairy tale like this. And so, for the Rachel Zeglers of the world or whoever is thinking this way about these types of stories, well, yeah, you're not going to get much out of it because you are seeking a materialistic kind of story with materialistic symbolism. If there is any symbolism, it has to be a materialistic symbolism. And yeah, that kind of person is bound to be let down by something like this. Okay, so I mean, really, that was the main scene I want to talk about. But I'll briefly talk about the my other favorite little scene, which is when the dwarves are in the mine mining for their gemstones. And they have a really cute song that they sing. And this is a song before Hi Ho, and kind of like the other song. These songs kind of bleed into each other and they sort of go together, but they are sort of distinct songs. And it's a cute song. They're just talking about working. And I love this scene. And this one in particular I find funny because I think of it from the perspective of Tolkien, who had these very serious dwarves in his fantasy that he wrote about. And I think that those are cool. I like those kind of dwarves too, but like I enjoy these more cartoonish, sort of more fairy tale dwarves in a way. I don't think they're as I think he didn't like that Disney was like, in his view, like cheapening these dwarves and like making like this sort of pop version of these sort of archetypal fairy tale creatures. But in my mind, I don't know, I think it's cute, and I like the way they're portrayed, and I still feel like they're magical. So to me, they still have a sense of magic, even though they're very jokey and the way they're portrayed, and it's very slapstick and silly and funny. There's still a sense of magic in there for me that I find really lovely. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Tolkien may have actually said about The Hobbit that when he first introduced the dwarves in The Hobbit, they were more of this sort of Snow White and the Seven Dwarves type of dwarves, more so than how he sort of later recast them in The Lord of the Rings. And I gotta be honest, I kind of like The Hobbit a little bit better than The Lord of the Rings, because I sort of tend a little more towards the fairy tale versus the fantasy, which I'll get into that in a little while, about the difference. I suppose one of the things that I like about these dwarves is that they do feel like these sylvan creatures, these magical creatures who live in the forest, who dig in this magical mine where all the gems are perfectly formed. But anyway, the last scene that I just wanted to reference, and I'm not even going to talk about it too much, but just to kind of touch on, is the ending scene, the happy ending. the prince wakes her with a kiss. And this was another thing that I think, if I'm not mistaken, Rachel Zegler sort of derided, made fun of, or sort of cast it in a creepy light or something. Oh, non-consensual or whatever. And again, it's taking that to do that is to take literal a thing that was never meant to be literal. We're in a symbolic world with fairy tales, and I think the symbolic world is the name of a podcast by Jonathan Pageau. He goes really deep into this stuff, deeper than I tend to. But if you're interested in that, you should definitely check out his podcast. But again, it's to totally miss the point if you're going to get concerned about that type of thing here. And so we could ask, what is the point then? And I think that if we think about it, you've got Snow White, who's sort of sleeping, sort of dead. It's kind of not really clear which. She's in this sort of state of suspended animation, and the prince comes and wakes her up. And to me, that seems to be definitely indicating some sense that, these are two aspects of your own soul that are coming together inside of your consciousness, and that there's something implying this sort of illumination, this waking up on a deeper level that the human being is kind of capable of. And I'm not saying that you need to be, again, I'm not saying you need to be religious or spiritual to even believe in this. I think you've got people like Sam Harris out there who are atheists but espouse a sort of waking up, a sort of idea that we can attain a sort of higher consciousness. So you can come at that from a more sort of atheistic perspective if you want to. But there's definitely some implication of the consciousness, the human consciousness has a potential for more than we realize. But there are multiple levels you could interpret it on. And if you wanted to interpret it just on the level of, like a human who is unhappy in their life, and then, there's a factor, and the prince is the factor, but, the factor could be many different things in reality. There's a factor that comes along and sort of wakes you up and makes you just happy in your life. That's another way you could interpret it that doesn't necessarily get all spiritual, right? So I think it's the beauty of these fairy tales is that they can be accessed on multiple different levels simultaneously, or, you don't have to interpret them just this way or that way, but you can interpret them. And most very materialistic people fail to do that. And a lot of very bitter people, will point out the fact that there's no such thing as happily ever after. Any story with a happy ending isn't really over yet, yada, 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 whatever. And yeah, of course that's true. But so what? So what? Like, that doesn't mean that the happy ending in a movie or a film or a movie is a film, excuse me, or a play, I was thinking, or a book, or in a story. That doesn't mean that the happy ending in a story can't be significant and meaningful and beautiful. Tolkien believed that the happy ending was essential for a real fairy tale, and and that was very meaningful to him, and it was probably tied to his own religious convictions. And stepping back more broadly, you could just say that it is tied to the perspective that is optimistic, in the sense that it believes that life is good. Life is good. It's good to be alive. We should be grateful that we were born into this life, even though there's suffering and pain and all of that. In the end, life is good. It was worthwhile to be here. It's beautiful. There's something beautiful about this human experience. And, that's really what the happy ending means in the fairy tale. So now I want to pivot over to talking more about the contrast between fantasy and fairy tales. And I'm going to be leaning a lot on Tolkien again for this because I think he has some really good insights in this. And I'm not necessarily a Tolkien worshiper. I'll describe a few points where I sort of diverge from Tolkien and sort of see things a little bit differently. But in general, I think he has some good insights to consider. But I do still have a few more things to say about that original 1937 Snow White, and a few ways that I think it is still superior to a lot of the contemporary films dealing with a sort of fantasy subject. And I don't even want to say that there are any films today that deal with fairy tales, because in reality, I don't think there are any fairy tales being made in contemporary times. There is fantasy, definitely. There's a lot of things you could describe as fantasy, but really nothing that you could call a fairy tale. And so maybe let's just start off by defining these terms. Fantasy attempts to have some plausibility. It tries to present something that feels like it could be real if the rules of governing physics allowed for magic or dragons or whatever. So Game of Thrones is fantasy because even though there's dragons and undead warriors and some magic, the characters sort of behave in ways that you imagine people might behave or could plausibly behave if these things were real. And a fairy tale is very different, not only because it tends to, these days, be aimed more at children. Of course, we know that Tolkien had a big problem with that, with crafting fairy tales only for children. He believed that that was a disservice to the tradition of fairy tales, which in the 1800s, 1700s, and earlier were folk tales that were aimed at much wider audiences. But basically, a fairy tale can make jumps in logic, leaps in logic that just wouldn't make sense in an ordinary setting. The characters can do things that kind of go against our natural sense of what feels realistic. Things often progress in ways that just don't seem logical. But that's part of the charm of fairy tales, is that their goal is not to try to seem logical or plausible. Their goal is to feel magical. And I would argue that fantasy often loses that feeling of magic the more it tries to present itself as plausible or realistic. And Guillermo del Toro, the director who was collaborating with Peter Jackson on the movie adaptations of The Hobbit, later had to stop working with Jackson because, according to del Toro, The Hobbit was a fairy tale, and Jackson was trying to apply to The Hobbit the same sort of criteria that had worked so well for him in The Lord of the Rings, without realizing that these are fundamentally two very different styles of storytelling that Tolkien was using. And I'm going to continue to reference Tolkien a lot in this video because Tolkien was such a champion of fairy stories, as he called them, fairy tales. However, he was very conscious of the fact that he was sort of pioneering a new genre in fantasy. And there's a few points where we probably would have disagreed if we were to have a conversation together. He, for instance, didn't like this sense of illogic that was in a lot of what he called Celtic fairy tales. He seemed to think that Germanic fairy tales, I suppose, were less illogical than Celtic ones. And in my opinion, I feel like there's a lot of leaps of logic throughout all the European fairy tale traditions. And I have a much more sympathetic view towards those lapses and leaps in logic than he did. I've already said that I believe personally that this is where a lot of that feeling of magic comes from, and he may have had a different opinion about that. But I also think that Tolkien is really interesting as a barometer, and in particular, a barometer for this thing that we call being a curmudgeon. Now, a curmudgeon is like, just think of that old grandpa sitting on the porch with a scowl on his face who just has nothing good to say about anything made these days, and everything in the old days was better, and everything now is, is crap. And Tolkien was a bit of a curmudgeon. And one example is his views on Disney and Snow White. He was born in the late 1800s, almost towards the year 1900. So he was about 40 years old when the 1937 Snow White came out, and he hated it. He did not like it. There are some great YouTube videos on, why Tolkien hated Disney, and you can go look those up if you want to dive deeper into his reasons. But you could basically sum it up as he didn't like the fact that Disney dumbed down the myths, the fairy tales, for a wider audience. He famously said that stories should be like clothes for children, made a little bit bigger for them to grow into, not like just exactly meeting them where they're at. And I think that is a wonderful way to look at it. So in his view, Disney was dumbing down these traditional folk tales, robbing them of their deeper essence in an attempt to reach a broader audience, and basically done for the motive of profit. And just to be clear, I'm 100% with him on this idea. But what I find kind of funny or ironic or sad maybe is the fact that if Tolkien were alive today, I think he would look at that original 1937 Snow White as like a masterwork compared to the kind of stuff that's being put out nowadays. So when I talk about Tolkien sort of being a barometer to sort of take the temperature of the current moment, that's kind of what I'm talking about. To him, Disney was a big downgrade, a degradation of the European fairy tale tradition. But I am willing to bet you, well, you'll never win the bet because he's not alive to tell us. But I would bet, if I could bet, that he would, like I just said, that he would say that the 1937 Snow White was like a work of art compared to the types of fairy tales, or what passes for fairy tales or fantasy, that's being put out these days. Because think about what Tolkien valued. He valued depth, and he was a very religious man. So he valued spirit, essence. He valued stories that contained deep seeds of wisdom. Now, that is oftentimes not understood or not appreciated because he often said that he didn't like allegory. So it seems from many of his comments that he made that he dissuaded people from trying to read deeply into his stories or try to pull out sort of symbolic, try to make statements that, this or that thing he was writing about was a symbol for something else. And I think that if you take him at face value, if you take those statements at face value, you're really going down the wrong path in trying to understand his approach towards writing. There is a YouTuber named Jess of the Shire who made a video about this, and it is perfect. She hits on all the right points. She expresses it perfectly. I highly recommend you go and watch that video. It's called "Did Tolkien Hate Allegory?" And she goes through all the quotes that he made where he explicitly says that he does not like allegory, but then she masterfully explains why, just because he was using a very narrow definition of the word allegory, it's not actually true in the deepest sense. And there are many ways in which you can read Tolkien's work as allegorical if you're interpreting the word allegory a little bit differently than what he meant when he was saying those things. But coming back to contemporary times, if and when a contemporary film makes an allegory, it's generally an allegory for something that's like on the social level. It's like on the level of just really shallow, superficial social dynamics. that's as deep as it ever goes. They don't make spiritual or religious or like things that go really deep and tap into the deep roots of human wisdom. They almost don't. Most production companies, most directors, most producers, they don't even seem to acknowledge the fact that there is such a thing as wisdom at all, or have any respect or interest in anything approaching traditional wisdom. And it's really hard to believe in the concept of wisdom if you don't have some reverence for some aspect of tradition. And so much of what we see these days is just trying to make things that flaunt tradition and thus flaunt conventional wisdom. And oftentimes what's flaunted along with conventional wisdom is just wisdom in general. Now, I'm sure that if you were to ask the directors and producers of Amazon's Rings of Power if they believe that there's such a thing as wisdom, I'm sure they would say yes. But I don't think that they conceive of wisdom the way that, let's say, that Tolkien did, or that the authors of the fairy tales from the European folktale fairy tale tradition conceived of wisdom, because they probably aren't very spiritual people. They certainly don't seem that way to me. I could be wrong, but obviously there's a lot of people who are spiritual and conceive of their spirituality in very materialistic terms anyway. So I'm not saying that you have to be a religious or spiritual person to write good stories. I'm just saying that they don't strike me as particularly deep. They seem to think that progress, like being progressive, is sort of as much wisdom as there is, and the things to strive for are the things that humans have been striving for since like the 1960s, and that's pretty much it. Like that's where history sort of like begins for them and wisdom begins. So to summarize, I think that Disney's 1937 Snow White was a big step down, was a degradation in meaning and wisdom, but that the degrees of degradation that we've kind of seen since then have been like categorically increased, so that we're at a point where there are so few seeds of wisdom in contemporary film that it's like basically it makes something like the 1937 Disney feel like a sumptuous feast in comparison. And I just want to go back to this idea of the curmudgeon, because a lot of people will hold up this sort of stereotype, the curmudgeon, to try to make the comment that, oh, there's always curmudgeons, and therefore, all the art that's coming out at any given point in time is probably good, and it's probably just people who can't get over the styles that they're attached to and can't make way for something new. And I think that's wrong. I think that is wrong. I think that degradation happens. The degradation of an art form is something that occurs at certain points in time. You can see it occurring in sculpture in the Mediterranean. In the Mediterranean, sculpture had reached a very, very high point in around like, the 100s and 200s AD. And then by like the 500s and 600s, and certainly by the 600s, 700s, it was at a very, very low point. There was a degradation that took place in the art form of sculpture in the Mediterranean during those years, and it took a long time to actually bounce back from that. And I think we're seeing something similar happening in storytelling. And this is not just a phenomenon of the last 5 years or the so-called like woke era. This really dates back at least to 20 years. Like storytelling has been shit for around like, let's say 25 years. Like, well, okay, maybe 20 years. I think the first few years after the 2000s, there were still some good things coming out. And then it starts to ebb, but like it really, even the good things, again, when we're saying what's good, we're comparing it to like what's now. So there are some things in the first few years of the 2000s that were still good compared to what's coming out now. But then if you compare that to the 90s, to the 80s, to the 70s, like the quality of film and storytelling that was going on in those decades was just a whole order higher. And I'm not saying that nothing at all was made in the last 25 years that could rival, the general things coming out during the 80s and the 90s. And yes, I know there are curmudgeons out there who would say that, no, it was the 60s and 70s when film was good and it got bad in the 80s. But I understand that there is some applicability of that view that, the curmudgeon is always wrong. But again, it's pretty undeniable to look at what happened to the art of sculpture between the years 200 to the years 600 in the Mediterranean. And I'm going to keep going back to that as a metaphor. There are times when an art form goes into decline. It's true. It happens sometimes. In order to get better storytelling, we need a population that has wisdom. We need people who are brave enough to engage with life and to get some battle scars, to, have experiences that when they come out on the other side from, they have gained wisdom. They actually know what they're talking about. They actually sort of understand life and people and the way things are and what it means to be here. And I just don't think we have a lot of those types of people right now at this point in our society. Or at the very least, those people don't seem to be getting access to the roles in which they can tell their stories. So the people who are getting the roles of the storyteller are not people who have those types of experiences, obviously. And we could extend this to the types of people who are supposed to be looking out for quality storytellers. Those people, the people who have the money, who can make productions happen, they also must be having a severe lack of the ability, a lack of wisdom to see what makes a storyteller really great. But that's it. That's all. I probably could go on and on about this, but I'm going to stop myself and I'm going to bid you adieu for now. I hope next time when you come back to my channel, I'll have a video that's got a lot more visual richness. Again, apologies for the fact that this one is basically just a rant without many visuals for you. But I will be coming back with a high quality, visually based video for the next one. My channel is not monetized. However, I do have a book that is available on Amazon right now. It was released recently, and it's called Thoughts. If you want to find it, just look up Brian D.K. Thoughts on Amazon. But make sure you have books selected when you search Brian D.K. Thoughts, otherwise it won't show up. It has around 150 illustrations. It took me about 10 years to make it, and it really is just a collection of random thoughts, thoughts on many different subjects ranging from mortality, romance, quasi-philosophical issues. Not as much art as this upcoming book will be addressing, but it's full of my art. So if you're interested in seeing my own drawings, then there's many, many examples in this book. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and ciao for now.